Two, three.
That it's such a blow always to me to discover that my voice is 25 decibels below what I think it is, and I was only comforted by finding that Margaret Sullivan, who I regarded as the glamour girl of all time, was referred to as that other Sir one time by a telephone operator when I was talking on the telephone.
Great. Nancy?
This is off the record. It all sounds as if we were a bunch of something or other.
Oh, Nancy, now really? Now, if you're going to have that.
Well, you can't help it.
It reminds me of that terrible trouble I got into describing the Taylor's thimbles.
I know. Well, I know about those.
We're sitting in the apartment of Nancy White in New York City on Wednesday afternoon, April 4th, 1979. And with me is Miss White and Sally Kirkland. Miss White, do you give your permission for this interview to be included in the oral history project of the fashion industries at FIT?
I do, but I understand that I have permission to see the transcript.
That's right, absolutely. Miss Kirkland, do you give your permission for this interview to be included in the oral history project of the fashion industry?
Yes, indeed, under the same conditions as Miss White.
Great.
Just that way.
Okay. Well, by means of introduction, I'd like to just take a moment. We have talked with Miss White before, and her history is certainly well known to those of us at FIT, and in fact to the American public, as the former fashion editor of Good Housekeeping, and the fashion editor of Harper's Bazaar, and then the editor-in-chief in 1958 of Harper's Bazaar. In addition to holding the prominent post on the National Council on the Arts, Ms. White has been a board member of many organizations and continues to be most active not only in the fashion industry but in life in general, 1979. And Ms. Kirkland, of course, is in the similar situation as the former fashion editor of Life magazine from 1947 to 1969. In 1955, she was the recipient of the Neiman Marcus Award, the same year that Vera Maxwell received her award, and of course the subject of our conversation today, and is the author of the chapter on Clara McCardle in FIT's publication of American Fashion in cooperation with the Fairchild Corporation. Well, as I said, this
You
is...
want to start my entire career at Life? Because I spent 10 years at Vogue before that.
That's perfectly fine, and I think we should
Okay.
include
All
that
right,
as
I mean,
well.
Nancy gets to have Good Housekeeping mentioned. I feel like
Absolutely, I'm sorry for...
Okay.
I didn't mean to neglect.
I was also 4 years
at
at Lord & Taylor under Dorothy Shaver at about the same time that Vera Maxwell was in the second flight of American designers, which Dorothy Shaver took the lead in promoting, if you recall.
Sure do. We're aware of that, and we're going to be talking about that
Yeah.
in just a few minutes. We are, in fact, for the record, we're going to be talking about today the life of Vera Maxwell as a designer, and of course anything that's particular from Vera Maxwell's life in general, which affected her life as a designer and a prominent member of the fashion industry for the last 50 years. Ms. Kirkland, before we began this formal interview, if we can call it that for a moment, you were sharing with me, you began to share with me the position that you saw the fashion industry, or that you see the fashion industry having been in the 1930s, the late 20s and the early 30s, when indeed Miss Maxwell left the field of dance. I think for a couple of years at that point she was married, had a child, and then entered the industry in the early 30s as a designer. Could you, if you don't mind my asking, would you go back to that period and sort of summarize what you saw or what you remember as the history of that period at the time of the 30s?
Well, first of all, when she went into the industry, before she went into the industry as a designer, she went in as a model, and she learned on the job as a model in a very, to me, unusual way. There are one or two of them in every generation that do take an interest in how those clothes came to be were brought about that they wear, but most of them are content to look their best and show them off to the best of their ability. Vera was working at one of the famous old tailoring houses, Linker and Herbert, I believe it was, and as a model, and as the tailor would fit her, she would be so interested in how the sleeve head went in and what made the lapel lie at a certain way in the back of the collar that he was in turn enthused about by her interest, and so he taught her a great deal right on the job. She then became an assistant designer, and I suppose this is all in the history in some other way, but I feel that if it has not been brought up in any other way, that I just like to mention that fact that she did, as a model, begin to learn how things were made, so that when she designed, she could then say to that particular tailor in her back room, the sleeve head is not working as I expect it to.
Sally, can I interrupt for a second? Because remember when she was when she was dancing with the ballet, and the ballet was at the old opera house, and therefore she was looking for work. She was hired literally on the corner of 39th Street and 7th Avenue, if what Vera's told me.
Yes.
And it's easy to believe she was looking for something to do to augment her income as a ballet dancer. And it was literally, I mean, it's so hard to believe in this day and age of sophisticated modeling and bookings and what have you and prices, but she and other pal apparently were sort of, oh, it sounds terrible to say picked up, but they were
No,
working.
actually, I have a sort of extension
Okay,
of that,
great.
because I remember having
Carry on.
I remember having the same kind of conversation where there was it was a little more structured than that. The ballet season was quite short, and the girls, many of them were indeed looking for work in between, and some of the dressers had contacts on 7th Avenue, and I believe it was through one of the dressers of the ballet that Vera got her first contact. And incidentally, as we all know, Vera is very petite, and the models, as we know them now, of course, are giants, but even in those days were a little taller than Vera. So her first jobs as a model were not to go out and walk around as much as to be fitted on. In other words, she was a second, she was Miss Average Woman kind of thing. That was another reason why she knew as much about the clothes.
What about the industry at that time, Ms. Kirkland, in general?
Well, I
Today,
think,
of course, we see a totally different
Yes.
picture, but what was it back in that period?
well, the conversation that you and I were having informally, what I was saying that at the time that Vera entered the field, that the kind of designer that we just take for granted now, the one that has quite a social life, probably an art collector, does a lot of traveling, did not exist in any much quantity. Most designers were, in fact, a great many of them were, it was all kind of in the family. I mean, Mr. X had a business, Mrs. X might be the bookkeeper, and daughter, Miss X or niece, would be the designer, which was not all that hard to do, because designs per se at that moment came from Paris, and it was just a question of going over with a certain amount of money to spend at the various French couture houses. The Mr. X had his bracket. He might be in the $30 to $40 price range, and his designer would pick the things that would be the most easily translated into that price range. He had a certain bracket at that time. I mean, he might make daytime dresses only, or he might make evening dresses, or he might make coats and suits only. The buyers who came in were pretty much confined to their bracket as well. Their private lives didn't enter into what they how
The
they dealt
mainstream of what they were.
how they dealt with the clothes. Vera and I must say she would be the first to include people like Claire McCardle and Claire Potter were a different cup of tea entirely. They came from outside the industry. Vera's father was a wine importer. Her brother was a professor at Princeton. She had been a ballet dancer. I mean, her entry into the industry was, as I said, not family oriented at all. But her life outside and her friends outside, who from the beginning were cultured. There was always a great deep interest in the opera and in all forms of philosophy, which I believe her brother is a professor. And she, quite early on, began herself to lead a kind of life. She got a house in the country down in the Bucks County neighborhood. She began to lead a kind of life herself that a great many American women were just beginning to lead. And she designed for herself, and it turns out that these women needed the same kind of clothes. It was not dependent on Paris at all. It was I would say this, they call them sportswear designers, and they say of the great American sportswear. It's a little bit less flat-footed than that. I think it was an attitude toward clothes that did come from the ease of the way sportswear clothes fit, with the sturdiness of the fabrics.
And the practicality of the design.
Exactly. And the design, exactly, that clothes were cut well, but simply enough so that they didn't have to have trimming, so to speak, on them. Therefore, they lent themselves to what is known as dressing up or dressing down. And as we were saying, were we saying it before or after we started taping, that after that this kind of thing, this kind of designing came about with Vera and her fellow women in the 30s, before World War II. Then when World War II came along, all designers were thrown back on their own resources without the elegant French. And Vera and her fellow sportswear designers not only had the jumping point of time, but it turns out that almost everyone's life needed that kind of clothes. I mean, the servants went off to the war plants. The people didn't have people to take care of their clothes, and they had to wear easy to take care of things around the house. When they were doing housework, they had to wear. They had to do a great deal of walking without gasoline. They needed warmth that still you didn't.
Well, they were wearing aprons for the first time. This is Claire McCardle's popover, which made everybody that was cooking something that basically they hadn't done that much of look absolutely adorable in the kitchen. But I think Vera was
I can remember Barbara Paley, bless her soul, who was Barbara Cushing in my Vogue days, and I can remember her saying, God bless that popover. I'm sitting down here at Pensacola shelling peas in my popover. It's a little hard to believe now, but her husband was indeed in the Naval Air Force or whatever at the time. Well, but to get back to this warmth thing, once again, it's the life that they were leading that led them to design, and that's when one of Vera's great innovations, the sort of sportswear evening, a wool for evening, wool for formal wear, came about. She was able to design something that she said herself, I can pile all my jewels on it, and yet it still was a gray cashmere wraparound sweater and skirt.
Well, it was such a breakthrough from the fact that the country club set, or whatever they were done up in satin or whatever with little fur horrors around their shoulders.
Are you referring to the stoles?
Yes. Anyway, they were looking, and along came a Vera Maxwell customer, person, friend, or whatever you want to call it, in a marvelous tartan plaid long evening dress with a camel's hair long coat lined with the tartan, and knocked over everyone.
And still does. That outfit, which
Because
I'm
that's,
is
We'd
still
all
the head of
wanna
every
own it
retrospective
today.
show. Exactly. Nancy was saying to John that you had said to me that you'd had an earlier conversation or two, and that everybody kept saying classic. They're as classic clothes.
Right.
And I got to thinking about that, and somehow or other, classic can, in fashion, be sometimes make it sound like a bore, or like a designer isn't really designing. In other words, just sticking to one last, so to speak. And I know that you agree with me that Vera's clothes are not that way, and so I went to the dictionary and looked up classic, and I would go along with one of the definitions, which is that of being of the highest rank. I certainly think that Vera's clothes are of the highest rank. I think they could even be called timeless. I would even go along. I would go along with that, and that they are not faddy, that in the here today and in the thrift shop tomorrow sense. In fact, it's very hard sometimes to tell what year Vera designed what style, and her fans are happy to say this is my 5-year-old coat or my 10-year-old dress. But I would like to be sure that we all realize that Vera's classics did not always exist any more than the Parthenon columns or the sonnet form existed. I mean, it had to be, her classics have to come into being. Today's innovation may be tomorrow's classic. And I think we've covered some of the things just in our earlier conversation, but she had to invent in the first place her weekend wardrobe of the 30s.
Which really, incidentally, coincided with the 40-hour work week.
Which was
So,
that's that other
when
point
we
in your
were
life.
given the weekend,
Right, exactly.
she designed for the weekend.
And she, well, I think we've talked about her evening dresses out of the sportswear fabrics, and I think she does indeed continue to innovate season after season, not in a wardrobe out moding way, but rather as a sort of a little spice to an existing wardrobe. And many of these today's, I think I'm maybe repeating myself, but many of these today's innovations, like the speed suit of 2 years ago, are tomorrow's classics. So
Sally, I think the speed suit goes back more than 2 years, does it not?
1975, you're quite correct.
Okay.
That is what's happening to me in time. 4 years
That's-
becomes 2.
Miss Kirkland, I'd like to go back, if I may, because I think I'd like your thoughts on some things that that we are aware of with regard to Miss Maxwell's life. She was a designer for many houses, at least 3 that I'm aware of. 3, set jobs that I'm aware of before she opened her own business in the late 40s. Dorothy Shaver, as the president of Lord and Taylor, believed in American design, and it was for that for that reason that she began her window campaign for American designers. I know that Vera Maxwell was part of the second wave of that, but from your own experience, can you go back to the beginning of that and maybe some of the thinking on the part of Lord and Taylor? Was that an isolated thought with merchandisers at that time? I mean, did Lord and Taylor hold that idea alone, or do you think it was?
Well, I certainly think
prominent?
they started it. I think Dorothy Schaefer very definitely started it. First of all, once again, back to women, she was one of the very few women powerful enough to dictate a policy at the time. And I think she was already herself, perhaps in another way, feeling the difference in women's lives in the 30s, the fact that they were having careers as she herself was, that they didn't have a time of day dressing, a homebody, and then I'd get something on for lunch and then come home and dress for dinner. I mean, she was very aware of American women's needs. She certainly, I believe, I know, was the very first to, in terms of women's fashions, promote, I hate that word, but call attention to via the
Recognize,
windows.
really.
And ads, enormous full-page ads, homegrown design. Now, the first group that she so honored were Elizabeth Hawes, who wrote the book Fascism in Spanish, if you recall, Muriel King, and a third that I, at the moment, can't remember. They were, at the time, made to order people themselves. I mean, they had private clients that came to them. They were not in the sense of the couture of Paris stores, and people didn't come to them, other designers, but they had private clients. And it just possibly may have been that Dorothy Schaefer wanted to break the news a little gently, rather than going directly to 7th Avenue. So as I understand it, and I'm sure Bob Riley will be part of our tape in the end, as I understand it, in the very beginning, those women, the same Lord and Taylor buyer that would have gone to Paris and bought from Schiaparelli or Vianney, went to Muriel King and Elizabeth Hawes and bought several outfits, paying a good sum of money. They were, after all, stitch by stitch, made to order clothes, and then had them adapted and or copied on 7th Avenue exactly as if they would have come from Schiaparelli. That, I think, should be checked with Bob. But that was the first group, was that rather rarefied Upper Madison Avenue kind. Then the second wave, of which Vera was very much a part, included Helen Cookman, who designed coats on 7th Avenue, and Claire Potter, who did beautiful, they were called sports clothes, but they were things like evening pajamas to wear around the house, and crepe, and lovely shirts and slacks, and soft wool.
She was another thinker as far as life was concerned. As far as the kind
She
of
had
life.
she had her little house up in Nyack, and she had a beautiful sense of color. Was she an artist herself?
No, not as far as
She
I
had an
recall.
artist's palette of.
But perhaps, indeed, she did. But I.
Those three, and then the fourth one, the only one that still stayed in the uptown bracket, so to speak, not 7th Avenue, was Sally Victor. And that was the second batch. And then after that, I don't know if it was so much a batch. I think then they were one by
Sally
one.
was a
click.
milliner.
Hmm?
Sally Kirkland, you point out that Sally Victor was a milliner.
Yes.
And-
Yes, that's right.
yeah.
Hats. When people used to wear those and spend money. Does that answer what you?
Yes, it's,
I think
it's-
there's no question that Dorothy Schaefer gets complete credit for the having the imagination and the guts to do it to begin with in
Absolutely.
the 30s.
Well, to interrupt for a minute, let's get into the fact that I think Dorothy Schaefer was probably the first woman store president, unless Beatrice Fox Auerbach was before. But in this day and age of
Yeah. I believe Dorothy Shaver was the first.
the first.
Mhm.
Well, that's important for your
Yeah.
history,
Yes.
John.
First major store president.
Staying in that period for a moment, if I may, then Vera Maxwell was started to design at a period when American fashion was beginning to have certainly a recognizable degree of respect with merchandisers. That there had been a few designers before her, as you say, the made-to-order designers of the first wave of Lord and Taylor, from which everybody, of course, began to learn certain things at home, so to speak, as opposed to the realization of what Paris was all about, or the training that Paris may have given to somebody. But she was working again for companies as opposed to the period of the very near future of working for herself. What was the life of a designer now during the war in this country, during World War II? We know that they were isolated. You referred to that earlier.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But their life in general, now of course everything has a name on it. Calvin Klein jeans, or Mary McFadden this, or whatever. That was not happening at that point, was it?
Oh yes, it was indeed. You see, there's a difference between what we just finished talking about, which is the Dorothy Shaver, Lord and Taylor 1930s, when there still was a Paris, and I didn't contradict you, but I would like to kind of qualify a little bit your statement about when they were getting so much respect from all the merchandisers. They weren't getting quite that much. It took somebody with the kind of Dorothy Shaver imagination. A great many of the clothes that we see now in retrospective shows, including Vera's own, which we all admire and think, oh, how contemporary, how marvelous, and so forth. The reason that they exist for the retrospective show is the fact that they were very often not bought by the buyers and went right back in the designer's own closet. I mean, it's because those clothes were not expensive and people didn't save them and give them to museums then. I mean, we're very fortunate in one respect that some of them didn't sell. But in the 1940s, we have a different situation entirely. There are shortages. There are no Paris designers. Whether the merchandisers are smart enough or not to know that a certain kind of clothes is necessary for a certain kind of women, they are eager to get those clothes into their store, and they will use the names of the designers, everybody's names. When you say Calvin Klein is on every pair of jeans, Minnie Mousemaker or something never heard of again, designed by so-and-so, would appear on certain clothes which were not original. They were just products. But now it was all American and blessed America. But I don't know if that's as important when you say what was life like to the designers, because they had limitations. They had, first of all, fabric limitations, as you know. They had fabric shortages, and also shortages of things that zippers, anything metal was in short supply, and just as they had begun to get interested in a few things like nylon, we all remember what happened to nylon stockings, the way they went, there were shortages of labor, of course, and so they didn't have at their disposal of a great choice of fabrics to choose from. Dyes were another thing that were in short supply. And I can remember a story from Hope Skillman about one of, it might have been about Vera or Claire, but one of that group of sports designers, when Hope Skillman brought in some of her beautiful cottons, which she made at the time, and not only had Lucky Strike green gone to war, but certain of the bleaches had, and so this white cotton wasn't really white. It was kind of off-white, and Hope was apologizing for it, and the designer said, "Oh, don't be silly. That looks fine." And a new color was born, which I think we still have, called bone, which was just the lack of white, actually, absence of white. Well, now the good designers, of which Vera was absolutely in the vanguard, they thought this was a sporting situation. They were glad to get along without the French, and at one point, toward the end of the war, Stanley Marcus, who was the head of the part of the War Production Board, which did decide on the amount of materials and so forth, they offered the designers an extra 3/4 of a yard. You can have a whole 3/4 of a yard extra to use in your clothes from now on, and the designers turned it down. They thought it was, they thought it was they were having a good time, you know.
Good for them, but Sally report, because I'm always wrong on whether it was L82 or L85, but it was exactly 2.5 yards of fabric. Is that not correct?
That I honestly think Bob Riley can rattle right so off. I hate to
sure
I
it
hate
was
to even
2.5.
take the tape
All
for
right.
it. I know that they certainly the although they didn't proscribe lengths, you couldn't make it much longer.
You couldn't use
Yeah,
more than 2.5
that's right.
yards of fabric. I'm
That's right.
convinced, but check it with Bob. And that's a very small amount of yardage
Yes.
when you're talking 36 inches.
Yes.
And that's why I didn't know about Stanley's getting the additional 1/4 of a yard,
Sure.
and they're turning it down, which I
Yeah.
think makes a fascinating history.
Well,
Carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, well, carry on in the sense of. I was just thinking of are we still talking in terms of during the war? Now, Lord and Taylor, my alma mater, and therefore I may sound prejudiced, but it was still very much a leader. But they had companions. I mean, Neiman Marcus, Magnons, Marshall Field, across the country, and when they would encourage some of these, I think, as a matter of fact, Mel Dawley told me when I was doing some research on the Claire McCardle book that very often they were able to sort of shore up a nervous manufacturer by informally buying together, very informally. But I mean, in other words, instead of one store coming in, if he knew that also was going to be Magnan and Neiman Marcus and so forth. As a matter of fact, the Palpable that we were talking about earlier, Adolph Klein, who was one of the more forward-looking designers on 7th Avenue, was still very nervous about that. I mean, he bought 50,000 yards of denim, which was a big investment
Hard to
at that
get in
time.
those days.
And well, he got it because, once again, this is the war production situation. He got it because it was supposedly going to save other clothes, wool for the men's uniforms or something. But anyway, he got terribly nervous about that amount that he had, and he said to Claire, "Are you sure that many, you know, Diana Vreeland type housewives?" this was appearing as a full page in Harper's Bazaar any minute, and the fact that he was assured by the other stores, and in fact, in the end, he wound up by using 250,000 yards of denim that first year.
Isn't
So it
that
all had a happy
fantastic?
ending. But
So
I
in
think,
one sense it was an exciting period for American designers, even though they had the restrictions of fabric and et cetera, but they were beginning to really set their own standards and set their own design wave, if you will, at that time.
it was an exciting period, and I have a very personal recollection of Bettina Ballard, who I was working on Vogue at this time, and Bettina Ballard had been the Paris editor for American Vogue before the war, and she came back in 1941 and stayed here, and with a little timeout for the Red Cross, but she did get quite a few of her clothes here for that period, and they were from the people like Vera, Sidney Raggi, Claire, Lucille Chapman. She went back once the war was over to take up her post again in Paris, and I can remember specifically her writing saying that Balenciaga had flipped over some of these things, it was too early for Dior at that point, but I think Schiaparelli was a great pal of hers, and she said, "What are these things you're wearing? Where'd they come from?" You know, kind of thing. So it not only was exciting the ones that did it well, not everybody, but the ones that we're talking about that did it well, when they were sort of unveiled after the war, and by this time this particular way of dressing based on the sportswear feeling of ease, but also flexible, and you could dress all day long in that type of dressing, had been christened the American look, and it kind of took off right around the world, I think.
Right at the at the end of the war, American fashion, of course, was on its own, so to speak, and was off and running, as they have said. Vera decided to open her own business. There's a lot of talk today about women's liberation and what women should be doing and what they aren't yet doing and what they could be doing, etc. This had to have been, even though it was part of the fashion industry, which was often characterized on one end as a woman's world, on the manufacturing end it was still pretty much a man's world. So in one sense she was entering a man's world at a very powerful position. I mean, as a designer, as a manufacturer, etc. What kind of a situation was that? I mean, you know, thinking back now, if you would, from an editorial standpoint and what you saw from your vantage point, for a person to make that decision at that time, was it a healthy market for a person to enter at that point, to strike off on their own, so to speak, to leave an umbrella of a parent company that has been supportive to some degree, given a person an avenue of design, to sort of drop all that behind them and say, hey, you know, I'm going to do it on my own?
I don't know if I could give too accurate an answer to that. I know that I, as a bystander, was terribly impressed that Vera was the only female member of the coat and suit
Council.
council, or however it was.
But I think she was unique, Sally, because if my memory is right, Claire had Adolf, and Claire
Yes.
McCardle had Adolf,
Claire didn't even become a partner until 1947.
and Claire Potter had Noodleman.
Yes, I see what you
I
mean.
think Vera was probably unique.
Oh, well, I agree with that, but I think the way maybe I didn't understand your question. But I was supposed to be knowing more what was going through her mind at the time
No,
that
I'm
she took
sorry.
this.
No, just-
because I just, much as I loved Vera at the time and all, I just didn't know what her. I mean.
I don't
Well,
think we
how
even
the
realized
financing
how
went up.
gutsy it
No,
was.
I don't.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
I don't
right.
think we were aware of what she was doing.
Yes.
Bonnie had, I can't remember, but Bonnie was.
Well, Bonnie went back to that same
Yeah, she was
Lincoln
not
Harvard,
on
and
her
then
own,
she
yeah.
and then she had.
No,
Mr.
I think this
Phillips
was terribly gutsy, but we just didn't,
Yeah.
say, wow, you're,
Yeah.
are you going in over your head? Or, I mean, we didn't think.
Have you got a good accountant or
Yeah,
anything?
exactly.
That's what I just.
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah.
that's why I misunderstood your question. I just really don't know enough about the. I've never attempted any to understand the financing or whatever of what goes on in Seventh Avenue,
But just
I agree
just
with Nancy in retrospect. She certainly.
that it was a
brave girl.
gutsy situation.
Yes.
To
It was a
for a
gutsy
woman
thing
to
for her to
strike
do,
off on
yeah.
her
Yes,
own at that point.
And furthermore, speaking of guts and speaking of design, I would say that the fact that a great many of these other people went racing right back to Paris and began it all over again, and Vera and some of her contemporaries did not. I mean, they stayed away from going to copy things and continue to make them. I mean, they stayed contemporary. I mean, skirts got longer as the war restrictions were over, and their skirts got longer and fuller and so forth. But they still did them in their own way, and they did not go back. I don't believe Vera ever went to Paris at all, but some of the others did. Some of the others had gone before the war. The ones that we keep talking about, like Claire McCardle and
Claire Potter.
yes, I was trying to think if Claire Potter ever went to Europe. There are some others. I don't know whether they're going to figure in any of your tapes. There are some others of that period. Josette Walker, for instance, was a very, very good sportswear designer and who was promoted a great deal by name at that time. She had gone to Paris earlier, and she never bothered to go back afterward. But
Well, then let's, if we may, then move forward to the period of the 50s. In the fashion scene, Vera, of course, was, I guess, one of the first designers to take a look at this thing called wool and realize that it had many more uses than it had at that point. You spoke earlier of the value of Vera's designs in evening wear using wool. Could you?
she'd done that earlier than the 50s. I would think, actually, speaking of fabrics, that one of Vera's contributions in the 50s was her willingness to have a look at the man-made fabrics. I mean, I think she used them. I mean, she'd been brought up as she says herself, a great fabric snob, and loved pure silks and the finest quality wool and all. But she was willing, she was open-minded enough to take a look at the man-made fabrics and see qualities that they had, like ability to stretch and that phrase that they call memory, to come back to, and packability, because at this stage of the game in the 1950s was when all the traveling by air was going on, and that's when you didn't have time to press that linen suit or that organdy dress, and it didn't. I don't mean to say that everything was man-made fabrics, but the man-made fabrics were certainly well handled. Could certainly save people a lot of space in packing and a lot of time wasted at the other end. I mean, the reason I'm doing this little hesitating is I keep thinking of that pejoratory phrase "drip dry," which was associated with the Americans traveling in that time in Europe. But I can also remember that sitting at the collections among some of the younger editors of Vogue and Harper's and all, who had on their little American sports designers' clothes, Vera's and Donald Brooks and people like that. And the Europeans they were not considered drip dry types at all. The Europeans were very impressed with them.
The period of the 50s then saw American fashion come into its own. Could you talk a little bit about that, the position of American fashion now competing with the French?
Well, now, you said the period of the 50s saw American fashion coming into its own. I think that once again, when American fashion really came into its own was when we were talking about in World War II, and after the war, a great many people went right back to Paris. I mean, I think that a segment of American fashion, the so-called sportswear, easy, casual feeling, stayed on its own, but I wouldn't say that you would use the phrase that it came into its own in the 50s. It came into its own in the 40s, then
Continue.
divided, or subdivided, or whatever. I mean, the people that were always going to admire French fashion and the feeling of French fashion, the more formal feeling, the more, well, in certain respects, beauty.
Mhm.
I mean, here's a whole country dedicated to fashion, France. I mean, to the making of beautiful fabrics and to the hand embroideries and the little special buttons and so forth. I mean, I don't think any American designer would want to take that away from them at all. And the people that did appreciate it and did have the clientele for it, did indeed go back to Paris. I mean, you can't knock Dior and and I think actually that the 1950s in world fashion, Dior and Balenciaga were very much at the top. It would be more a different in a different area that the American. I just always stop when I use this word sportswear because it's the designers that came out of sportswear, but they were able to design clothes for any hour of the day, and they were able to sell them and to have them be merchandised that way. And which reminds me, I would like to go back. You are, I presume, going to talk at some point to Marjorie Griswold,
Yes.
because at one point when I was describing the fact that Mr. X and had his little category, and he could only make evening dresses, or somebody else could only make suits and so forth, and that the buyers bought that way, and their life, their own personal life didn't particularly affect their buying or something. There was a new breed of buyer that came along, very much led by Marjorie Griswold in this period at the end of the 30s and through into the World War II. And if Marjorie saw a coat someplace that she liked, one of her so-called resources, where she was supposed to buy only dresses, and if that designer had made a coat, as Vera would have, not being categorized, Marjorie would buy it and have it in her department, and the coat buyer could scream and yell. It didn't matter. I mean, it was not from one of the coat buyer's places, and so there was a really tremendous breakthrough as far as breaking down these tight little categories of merchandising, and she would be a marvelous one. I'm awfully glad you're going to talk to her about that. But now I went back in order to go forward. I was just going to say in the 1950s that it was kind of a three-way street. It wasn't. It could not be classified as a decade with America coming into its own. No, I mean, because Balenciaga and Dior were still sitting very, very much on top of the world. They'd been joined recently by an exciting something in between, the Italians. The Italians came along, and they were more slapdash than the French. I mean, they didn't sit up all night to make every little buttonhole. They were more like the Americans in liking the ease of clothes, but they had their own thing, which was very, very colorful, very flamboyant, very dashing, and I think that I would say that the 50s really, the 50s and on into the 60s were when fashion became pretty worldwide. I mean, Spain cropped up toward the end of the 50s, and then the English certainly came along in the early 60s, so that so much of it has got to do with this travel. I mean, once you get people getting back and forth in 6 hours, I was down in Soho the other day for brunch at the WPA, and who's at the next table? Givenchy. Now, that's bound to rub off on him, and I think it goes both ways. I mean, I think people go over there and.
Oh, it's Sally. It's as Marjorie Rich, and I give her great credit. When this is when she was at Macy's, she said the greatest influence on fashion in the '60s was the jet airplane.
Exactly.
No question about
Yes,
it. I mean, they were coming over here, and
Right.
we were going over there, and everything was shortened.
Yes,
I mean, suddenly it wasn't a big production, and it didn't have to take you forever, and you didn't have to pack 9 suitcases. And
Yes, exactly.
And polyester, not polyester, but drip.
Well,
dyes were
man-made.
coming
We've
in,
just
yeah.
been through that. I hesitated because
Okay,
I said
sorry.
that awful drip dry connotation, but there really were some absolutely marvelous man-made things that did save everybody's life.
Well, but
That I do think that it's all wrong to say that the 50s were the decade when America came of age. It's really when, well, I think Nancy's giving credit to Marjorie Rich. It's when everything got global. We had our thing to contribute, and the others, the French came back, the Italians emerged, the Spanish emerged, the English went absolutely dotty. I mean, they threw the empire over and turned into swinging London, and it was,
In the middle of the 50s, as I noted earlier, both you and Vera Maxwell received the Neiman Marcus Awards. Did you see that in any way as a continuation of what Lord and Taylor had once done with regard to noting American design, or was it?
No, I don't believe so, because I think that I don't know how long the Neiman Marcus Awards had been going. I certainly think they've been going for several years before
I think
that
the late
year.
40s, wasn't it?
But they were very global. They for instance, the year that we got our awards, Pierre Balmain was there from Paris, and I believe an Italian accessory person, plus Grace Kelly,
Right.
who was as a given the best customer award or whatever. So I don't think they were the same at all. Dorothy's were always only American, and Stanley Marcus's, or rather Neiman Marcus's awards were not only global as far as nationality concerned, but also in what people did. I mean, I think Dreyfus was our year too. Henry Dreyfus, industrial designer.
But with regard to American fashion, if I can go back to this point, because I appreciate the clarification, and I think it's a point well taken. Isn't it true, however, that American designers, let's look at it another way if I can. The American woman going into a shop to buy that special evening dress or that special costume for some nature or other, reason or other, wasn't the American designer still fighting for their own at that point with regard to that particular customer, that the label, as you pointed out, Balenciaga and Dior were still sitting right there at the top. Would you say that American designers were sitting in a similar perspective at that point, or weren't they still fighting that, I guess, dimension, if you will, or position, anyway, in the mind of the American consumer?
I don't know. I think we still get back to this fairly limited group that that design personally for themselves for a sort of an American. You quoted Marjorie Rich. I remember Diana Vreeland telling the Time people when they did a cover on the American sports designers, including Vera. A cover story, and I remember that Diana said they gave the American women a look of their own. And the people that stayed with that, I don't think were as influenced by Dior and Balenciagas, but I do think there was a great many designers that were perfectly content to follow in the general trend of thinking of Balenciaga, if when he loosened suits up, somehow
Gave us
or other,
our
all
necks and our wrists.
that's right, exactly. And I don't think that they necessarily felt felt like fighting to do something different, just to be doing something different from Balenciaga.
No, they were impressed by the master. So we're talking about this sort of very small nucleus, in a way.
Yeah, the Veras,
These
yes.
people, the women, strangely enough, most of them were women.
Well, it's very important that they were women.
Yes.
Really it is, because that's the idea, that they were leading a life that, Vera with a son and a house in the country, an apartment here, they weren't just ivory tower drawing board
Not at all.
types.
No, I think that's what's important. They stuck to their lasts. And believed in their lasts, and there was a customer there, and heaven knows, I guess you and I were customers, not just because we were editing, but we knew that we had a reader out there that understood. I mean, that needed it,
Yeah.
and so we reported it.
Well, I mean, I certainly indeed treated myself to a Dior one time just for kicks, and I could only wear it after two soup meals. I mean,
Soup and Fisher.
That's right, exactly. I mean, I couldn't just put it on any old day at all. I mean, I had to. It was really production the day I wore my Dior. I mean, it was planned for the night before and so on, and so I think that maybe that's not the most attractive thing about to say about me as a dresser, but it certainly was true. We had a lot of us that did dash around, and again, all that once again, a Dior with all of that buckram and whatever took up a whole suitcase. And when we were getting on that jet and going to London and staying 2 days there, and in Paris for a week or 10 days, and then off to Italy and back, our friend Vera and this little nucleus that we talk about were the answer. I think, Nancy, I'm thinking about your esteemed Aunt Carmel, who certainly did just as much, if not more, traveling than we, but who had a different, and who dressed almost entirely, as we all know, with the French. She had a different attitude. She was perfectly, and it's maybe a different generation's attitude, because she was perfectly willing to wear that same Balenciaga suit day after day after day after day after day. So she didn't need to take many things around. I think we got sort of carried away by a little variety that Vera and her pals gave us, a little color and so forth. I mean, we didn't like that idea of that you had to put all your income into one good thing and wear that one good thing over and over and over.
Well, that's right. Carmel always used to say, buy one good thing, and that this is what the advice she gave me when I was young. However, having been with her in Paris and knowing that she changed her clothes 3 and 4 times a day, and having seen her personal maid, pressing and the closet, she did when she was in Europe. Now, here, granted, she'd wear the same pink Balenciaga suit maybe all 5 days of the week. But over there, wow.
Yeah.
4 times a day, at least, she changed her clothes. And
Did she by any chance, this is a little off the subject, but did she by any chance do what Bettina Ballard
no,
did?
No,
Because
no.
Bettina used to change her clothes by designers, and in the days when they had a 9 o'clock collection, a 12 o'clock collection, a 3 o'clock collection, a 5 o'clock, and a 7. She would be pretty busy getting into her Schiaparelli at noon and her Balenciaga at 3.
Well,
and her
Carmel would do
Givenchy.
it, but she didn't buy from that many people.
Yes.
Remember, she basically bought
Yes.
from Madame Grey, and first of all from Balenciaga and Dior and Madame Grey. Maybe something from...
But Nancy, I do think there is something that I'm wrong about your aunt, and you certainly know, but I do think that our generation and our pal designers of our generation, who we were editing and enjoying seeing a great deal socially. We all lived the same kind of lives and weren't loving wearing their clothes. I think they did give us variety. None of their things cost all that much.
Oh no.
And so you could have, the saving up for the one good suit, which I did from time to time. I mean, I tried a little of everything, but the one good suit made me so nervous. I just felt kind of drab in it instead of like, oh well, now today I can wear the purple belt with my jersey dress.
No, I think if we fell in love with something, I mean, if there it was, and it absolutely was right and suited our shapes as well as our awful expression lifestyle. I used to buy it in 3 colors or 4 colors, and pile on the pearls with one and scarf it up with another or something. At least that was my theory as far as American.
Yes, well that's a form of variety. I think maybe just to clarify my one good suit complex, it's an admission of weakness on my part. I would lose all personality the minute that I had to get one good suit. I mean, I would be so panicked for fear that, it wound up by being the plainest buttons, the plainest collar, the plainest, just no zing at all to it, because I was spending so much money on it. I was afraid I was going to get tired of it too soon.
You were locked into it.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
you did
back
have your
to
green
what we're
suit.
really talking.
You did have your green suit, number 37.
Oh, from Nina Ricci.
From Nina Ricci, the first.
But
year
it was bright green.
It was
and
bright
I didn't
green,
get tired
and it was
of it.
number
That's true.
37. Why I remember, I don't know.
I can remember number 444 at David Goodstein's, the button up the front dress. That's very fascinating for your tape, yes.
Okay, enough of that.
Enough of that, yes.
You wanted to get back to a point though, Nancy. Or Sally.
That's Sally.
I think I did get back to it. I think, in a sense, I did. When I said something, I got back about the buyers, some interesting buyers like Marjorie Griswold leading that kind of a life too. And then I know what I said. I came back and said that I wanted to keep you from saying that the decade of the 50s was the emergence of American design, but I think we got that one done, haven't we?
Good.
Nancy, on or off the tape, is it by any wild chance vodka hour?
Of course.
I would adore a little splash.
Any hour is vodka hour. You'd like a little splash.
Yeah, a little splash of water on it.
After
My voice. With our conversation about Vera the person, Vera the designer is very connected with Vera the person, and en passant, as we were saying, I'm amused by Vera's being a designer herself, but she will pop into Lamston's and buy a man's shirt, and wear it, or those little socks and so forth. But what I did remember so much, she does have, and deservedly, a reputation as a hostess. She's not only an excellent cook herself, but has a cook who has retired, but from time to time will come back Vera entertains. And it's kind of a privilege to go. Vera is very smart, never to have too large a table. 7 is at the most, and usually when the cook comes in with a souffle at the end, and we all applaud. And Vera makes a little centerpiece in the table. She has a drawer in her apartment full of little metal figures that she's collected over the years, and she can make something of the cord of the time of Henry V and the various wives, or Anne Boleyn, or there'll be the horse guards. You must get her to show them to you sometime. My memory's not so good about that. But this never complained, never explained time. She had asked for lunch Brendan Gill and Carol Phillips, who used to be on Vogue, and who is now the head of the Clinique part of Estee Lauder, and Marion Donovan, who's an old friend of Nancy's and mine, and I can't think, maybe she was a Bogite too at one point. I know that she made a million, she's an inventor. She announces her, she's an inventor. She made $1 million by, really $1 million. She announced that at lunch that day by selling a diaper cover in patterns. Nobody ever thought of that. That's all parenthetical. 1, 2, 3, 4. Me, I'm among the guest list. And Jim McMullen. Now, Jim McMullen has a very successful restaurant on 3rd Avenue and 77th. And he's a mad fan of Vera's. Even before he knew that Vera had any connection with Princess Grace, Jim McMullen has always loved Vera. I've often lunched there together, and you're not allowed to have reservations, but he somehow or other, seems to find us a place, and we compare recipes and so forth. So now here's Jim McMullen at this lunch. He's now got a restaurateur. She's got the head of the preservation of our civilization, practically Brendan Gill. She's got a millionaire, self-professed. Marian Donovan said she sold that diaper cover for $1 million.
She sold her the diapers.
The diaper cover, whatever it is. I'm an inventor. What do you do? I'm an inventor. And whatever. And she has Carol Phillips, ex-Vogueite, and the vice president of Estee Lauder. And the cook doesn't show up. And so I happen to get there about 5 minutes before most of the people. I think Brendan Gill had arrived and Vera was in, calmly talking to him in the living room, and I stopped to put my coat aside, and there was Kika, her all-the-time maid, who was going to serve, presumably, this great lunch. And Kika's little nose was absolutely right up to her eyebrows. She said, "Look, look," and there was a Stouffer's box of spinach souffle and a store-bought chicken. A pile of sort of crumbly stuffing kind of thing, you see. Well, nothing to do, but out I went and enjoyed my drink, and the table was, as usual, beautifully served and set up, and it was a marvelous wine, and Stouffer's souffle came, and the chicken with the crumbly stuffing was passed, and it was a marvelous lunch. Everybody was in good form. I mean, Brendan Gill had some funny stories and so forth. And then we went into next door, had coffee, and I believe that particular dessert actually came from was not a Stouffer.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then everyone left, and I stayed for a second to talk to Vera, and that's when she said, I said, she's a fan. He's never done this before, but she called me at 11 o'clock. Otherwise, I could have cooked lunch myself, but there wasn't any time. I said, well, I think it went off marvelously, Vera. I wouldn't have really known except for Kika's expression. And she said, well, never complain, never explain. And not one single word did she say that whole lunch with a restaurateur and everything there.
Well, there was another time when. Is that on?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
The opposite side of the coin, when once again what is her name, didn't show up, and Vera cooked us the most beautiful petite marmite within. Seems
Well,
to
yes,
be
she
half
can.
An hour.
Yes, I did preface this by saying that Vera is a marvelous cook, and like they say, marvelous cooks can make. I mean, in other words, marvelous cooks make other marvelous cooks because they can tell them what to do or respect them. But this time, there's no time for anything. But
Sally, if we can go back, I know that you were a guest at Vera's salons, which she had during the war. In fact, she told us a wonderful story about a young man who I think was from Australia and came as a guest to one of her salons, and she heard from him for many years thereafter. So they were important moments during the war when people got together and commiserated or had
it was
fun
a,
or
it was a
whatever.
charming custom. It really was. I mean, it was every Thursday you were expected there. You didn't have to say yes or no. It would have made me awfully nervous not knowing how many lumps of ice or whatever to have, but that was very much the atmosphere. Just drop in if you can, kind of thing, and you would find possibly in Australia and your best friend or something. And this particular night that I remember, and this is back to Vera being this Vera's own sympathy and her own feeling for clothes transmitted to other women and her friends. This particular time, I had arrived directly from the office at Vogue, and I had on a little gray jersey, one of these L85 2.5 yard type sheaths. It was fortunately sleeveless or had nothing much going on up top, and it was also fortunately untrimmed. So I had lots of pig skin around my waist and over my shoulder, and foulard scarves, and that whole bit. And I suddenly was called to the telephone while having a drink with Vera and her guests, and told that we had 2 tickets to the opening of some marvelous show. I don't know, the follow-up to Oklahoma or something, and like 20 minutes to get to the theater. So Vera took it as a challenge. Follow me, said she, and I went into her room, and off came all the pigskin, and she got out some paste, some marvelous paste clips, and I think one went here, and one went on my neck, and one went at my waist. Fortunately, I'd had some gray jersey gloves, so I was kind of the pigskin department was thoroughly gotten away with the belt in the bag. And then, as a final touch, she produced a mink coat that she'd gotten kind of bored with the mink coat with the collar and the cuffs and so forth, and she just had it cut off. It's the first time I ever saw it. The kind of thing that's accepted now, treating fur with kind of like it's just an old tweed.
A nonchalance.
Exactly, and throwaway chic or whatever they call it. But anyway, it was a cardigan, and she'd lined it with gray flannel. And the gray flannel, it was thrown over my shoulders, and off I went to the opening, and I was photographed, and people came up and where did you get that outfit? It was just a great moment in American.
Well, I'm sure the paste probably came from the five. She's she's got buckets.
Oh,
Wonderful jewelry.
she's got. Well, I'm not so sure. I think that paste came from great aunt.
Oh.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And incidentally, whether for the tape or not, if Vera hasn't said this to you, somebody ought to say it. The family in Vienna, when we said she was not associated, the father was a wine reporter, she was not associated with the 7th Avenue families.
Mm-hmm.
That actually, the family name, instead of Huppé was Fawn Huppé. And when they came here, they dropped the fawn, and very democratically and so forth. And Vera says, with a little twinkle in her eye, a couple of years ago, when every other woman was walking down the street with that wrapped dress of Furstenberg, Dion Furstenberg, maybe that was a mistake if I'd known I was going in the dress business.
She does have a wonderful sense of humor.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it must have, not to be maudlin, but there is a side of Vera which is seldom talked about, and she did have some tragedies in her life. She had 2 divorces.
Mm-hmm.
She certainly had a wealth of joy from her son, Dr. John Maxwell, but she did have some tragedy. And it must have been a sense of humor and an early learned sense of survival, I guess, that carried her through. That she, even in business, because the next period that we should look at, I guess, is the 60s. And although great success in a design sense, and in a creative sense with her Indian collection, it was not a success financially.
No,
In fact,
no,
she
which-
talks about the
It's a disaster.
years.
Yeah. She's had almost, well, she's had 2 or 3 close calls. Back to your original thing about being on your own. She says that she might have gone against the wall with the ultra suede commitment she made. I don't know. She's, I'm sure, had sadnesses. I'm sure we've all had sadnesses. I don't particularly. I think she's got the strength to be a survivor, but I think that she's had quite a fulfilled life, as well as the inevitable disappointments.
I never knew either husband, so I'm.
Well, there is. I don't know whether this is for the tape or not, and I just trust your good taste. But there is a very kind of yeah, it is a sort of poignant story about the first husband, Mr. Maxwell, who did, I think, do a bunk out or something, and John never knew him. And one time, and he also was resentful and apparently didn't, or said he didn't want to. And then there was a period when one time, I think I will ask you not to, although Vera did never tell it in a you know, confidential kind of thing, but I just think it's, you know, not for a
Yeah,
great
we can
audience.
just-
But
just
anyway,
wipe that out.
it's again confirms part of what you say, but it's also, I think, a rather, as I say, romantic, poignant little story. This man, Mr. Maxwell, called one time when John was, maybe in his late teens, maybe a medical student. I'm not quite sure. He was certainly not a child anymore, and said, "I would like to see you." And John went to Vera and said, "I'm not sure that I do." And Vera said, "Well, you do exactly as you please." And then he said, "Well, maybe I'd like to see at least what my father looks like." And so they had this conversation in which the father was going to be at such and such a corner, 45th and Broadway at 12:05 on Wednesday. And John went. And maybe the father was there and maybe he wasn't, but nobody ever came up and spoke.
How the hell do you recognize one another?
Well, I don't think that would necessarily. I just think maybe the father wanted to have a look at him, or maybe
Just
he
looked
wasn't,
in
whatever.
one way.
But that really, I guess you better
Yeah,
agree. I mean,
yeah.
I just think we're all having a little fan club meeting, and I thought you'd be
Yeah.
interested.
That's-
You know.
And then who was the second husband, Sam?
Second husband was a delightful guy named Scotty. I think off. Is it too terribly much trouble to do that? Isn't that the okay way to say?
Yes, exactly. In
Well,
the
only rap.
60s, in the 60s, Vera did do the Indian collection. I guess it's a fair question to ask of editors at the time. Was that a mistake on the part of the designer at that point?
I don't know. You want to take that or shall I?
You better take it because I never saw it.
I never saw it either. I've seen the remnants
I'm
of
sure
it.
I have too.
I would
Could I just
say.
interrupt and ask
yes,
why you never saw it at the time?
Didn't she give it in Europe and?
I have no idea, Sally. Obviously, you know.
Oh, I can
Through
tell
a
you.
lot.
I can tell you, as a matter of fact, and this is again not for the tape. I was having I was supposed to go to Monaco and see it, and I had a personal. My daughter was very sick that summer, so I canceled my trip to Europe.
was shown in Monaco then for the first time.
and as a matter of fact, I think Eugenia went in my place and stayed in my room, or Eleanor Lambert went in my place with Eugenia or something. But I might also add, not of any interest to your readers or listeners, I guess we have to say, that when I was on Life, I did not see as many of Vera's collections as I would have when I was more specifically covering for Vogue the young and or sportswear market. Well, on Life, I was responsible for everything from Maximilian Furs to the dime store to, in other words, it was not always possible for me to go to exactly to go to every single collection kind of thing. But I think that that anybody that does a complete now let's all and does all that research and whatever, and now let's all act like American Indians or something, is in danger of making a mistake. That's all I can say. I think that when you go to Mexico and think that those pleated skirts look great with black cashmere sweaters, that's one thing. But I don't know, and I guess I should disqualify myself because I didn't ever see it all really put together, but I have a feeling that anything that is too top to toe another ethnic or another period is not right to do. Now,
I understand it was done for
Giorgio Sanangelo came. Oh, you mean
the Indian costume was done for Princess Grace's Red Cross show.
That may have made her make it a little bit more. I know that's where we were supposed to see it. Now, whether it was shown back here in the usual 7th Avenue way, don't forget they didn't have quite so many shows back then, did they? I think you might have gone
I
in.
haven't a clue. I mean, in other words,
But I think Vera gets a little understandably bitter when some years later Giorgio Sanangelo did a complete Indian collection, and it got an enormous amount of publicity. Now, I'm not terribly sure it did an enormous amount of sales. It did get an enormous amount of publicity, and
that's happened to Vera a couple of times, hasn't it? I mean, you mentioned earlier the Ultra Suede, where
yes,
the first year there were no sales. I mean, regardless of how great the idea was. Shirley Goodman shared with me earlier today that, as far as her memory serves her, she bought the first Ultra Suede that Vera made. But as far as sales went, generally, it was not a success. It was a
it laid
flop.
an egg. The buyers didn't understand it at all. And Vera's the first person to admit that had Halston not come along with it,
she's
would have
very
been
good that
with
way, very gracious
a
about
vast
that.
amount
Yeah,
of
right,
Ultra Suede.
Well, you can imagine if I heaven knows, I think some buyers are great and some buyers don't seem awfully bright to me sometimes, but I can imagine being shown something that costs twice as much as real leather and being told that it isn't real leather and wondering.
Yeah.
It was the performance record that I think got it. But Vera showed great, I think, well, we keep using this word guts, but guts and imagination to begin with.
Sure, I told John, I told you how she found it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Vera herself is the best person to talk to about the 60s because she says it, I'm sure you stop me if we're using valuable tape. She says it absolutely, it just was not her bag. I mean, and it's funny, as a matter of fact, I think back at the Indian collection, possibly if she'd taken a few of those Indian headbands and She would, but she just, I mean, the Flower Children and the,
miniskirt
mini
and-
skirts and the Swinging London and the, you know, Haight Ashbury, plus, and once again, subject to censorship, but the personal life in Monaco with her very good friend,
Pierre.
yes, was keeping her not that fascinated by the Seventh Avenue daily thing. So I mean, she just sort of kind of writes off the '60s. I mean, normally when you talk to her, just like
She sort of said she didn't pay much attention.
right, and it wasn't. And if she had paid attention, she wasn't sure she would have made it right, made it work.
But
So
she's-
I think what's so great. I mean, I hope we're ending on an upbeat. I think it's just absolutely marvelous that here she is, 70, whatever she's calling herself today, 74, 75,
75.
75. Okay, and I'm not not implying that she's any more. I never can remember. It seems to me I'm creeping up on her, but. She keeps saying you're so much younger, and if I don't look out, or she doesn't look out. But anyway, I think it's great that here she is. Well, now, I just mentioned earlier Soho. I write this little column for
Yes, I know.
Mr. Round Report. And I'm doing one on Soho, and Vera said, "Oh, that sounds fascinating. I love to see Soho." And so I said, "Fine." And down we went. You know, that's the day that we went to lunch at the WPA and so on. And she loved it. She wandered around. She organized a man to make some hats for her show. Everything was. She had a lovely time, and away we went home. Now, 2 weeks pass, and I meant to call her because I hadn't seen much of her, and we often have a neighborhood lunch at Jim McMullen's off his Stouffer's souffle, probably. So she called and I said, "Oh, I was just thinking of you," and she said, "Well, how about lunch?" I said, "Fine, like Jim McMullen." She said, "Well, what about Soho?" So down we go to Soho again. I mean, you know, she's got she really.
Pizzazz for life.
Yes,
Yeah.
oh yes, and she popped in and out of, stopped and got bread at a marvelous place called Vesuvio, and bought a dangle at another place. And no, she's a
She's got great curiosity. I said
Yeah.
that.
great curiosity and great stamina to get it there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious, but I'm apt to sit here and let other people tell me about it. If it's 4 flights up or something. But.
Let me, not for necessarily for a closing, well, I've 2 things left. One, about 6 months ago, Madame Gray was in New York and for the Musicians Benefit Fund, and we had the opportunity of interviewing her at that time. And one of the questions that was asked of her was, did she think there was such a thing as American fashion? And she hesitated noticeably, and she said, which is, excuse me, evidently very rare for Madame Gray, that she really didn't want to answer the question, but so long as it was asked of her, she would. And she said that in her estimation, there is not an American fashion. That America, and I'm summarizing her statement, but America has the incredible ability to take from another country and do it oh so much better. How do you feel about that?
I don't really agree at all. And I think with all great respect to her, I just don't think that she gets around America enough to answer that. Is that what you said? I saw you giggling. No, she's marvelous. She's great, but I mean, in her little turban ivory tower. But
And exposed.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, God, my gosh, she's never gotten off the St. Regis roof, has she?
I took her to Bird Dog once, and I reported that on my.
Right.
All right, now ask Sally the next question, and see what she comes up with.
The next question being,
That you asked me. I think it came right after Madame Gray.
help me, Nancy.
Where do you place Vera?
Oh.
Okay, now you got your.
In the,
We'll turn it on.
it is, in the history of American fashion, where would you place Vera Maxwell?
You see, I think, like I said, I almost had to disqualify myself on something else. I place Vera in a group of people that I admire enormously. And that group, to me, is headed by Claire McArdle. I'm sorry, there's no other way I can say it. And but I think that she is. I love the group. I mean, I lived and exuded with the group, and I think that this American sportswear designer, and a very small, a very elite one, possibly at the most half a dozen, maybe not even that. I think Vera's right in there. And then I would like to go on to say that if you had asked me that question maybe 10, 20 years ago, I would have been a little bit stronger on my choice, but that now, as time goes on, there's nothing like longevity and fashion survival and zazz. So I would say, oh dear, that Vera is.
Well, Sally, wait a minute. Let me tell you what I told John when he asked the same
Yeah.
question.
Oh.
And I said, I believe something like I placed her firmly in the backbone of American fashion.
In the mainstream, or the what?
Backbone.
The what? What?
Backbone.
Backbone. Oh.
So you can disagree with me to make this more interesting.
No, I don't know what you mean. Backbone. I don't know quite what you mean by backbone. I mean, backbone sounds to me more like, maybe Dorothy Shaver would be backbone. Whatever. I don't know. I don't think backbone sounds creative enough.
All right. Well,
I mean,
then
all right. I mean,
you
if you,
think of the word.
I don't know. I mean, I've told you that this is a tough question for me because I, unfortunately, am associated in every way with Claire McArdle, who I do regard as America's greatest designer to date. So do I say I think Vera's second or third or fourth or whatever? I don't think it's.
I'm not sure
I don't think you
necessary.
should put me in on this one. I just think that the concept of the American, well, all that stuff we were talking about earlier, of the American
You really
woman
said
that came
it.
along. What?
You really said it. I just was
Yeah.
wondering if you'd come up with or argue with me on by backbone. I mean
No,
not orthopedic, but When you think of what is the spine of American fashion,
I honestly,
think she's in the backbone.
yeah, but I think probably a lot of other people are too.
Sure.
I don't think
I
that's.
didn't say she was the backbone.
No, but I think I
To
don't.
fit
I
in.
think we can. Can we think of anything a little spicier to say about her than that?
Well, it was the only thing I could think of at the time, and that's why I brought it up
Okay, Nancy.
this afternoon. See if you can.
Well, now I tell you what I was trying to get at was the fact that so Picasso's got longevity, and he did an awful lot of creating, and Vera has got longevity, and she's done an awful lot of creating, and it is unfair to ask me that everyone in the world thinks that Claire McCardle was the greatest designer, ever, to put Vera above her. But now, if there's a way to say that Vera has carried, I think that Vera has carried on. Maybe this is backbone too. I don't know. Whatever has carried on with increase. Continuing to put. We get all these cliches now, but to inputting or to continue on adding ideas to something that I feel did start in these United States in the 30s and 40s.
And she's a survivor.
And she got right,
American
exactly,
fashion has
right.
survived because
A
of-
survivor in the marvelous sense. We're lucky that she survived.
A survivor and an adder.
A
and-
starry survivor, a sparkly survivor. How about that?
Okay.
Okay. Many of those. Well, the only other one is Monty Cashin.
Will be.
Nancy, however, he has to write the thing. Today is the day. You
I
only get a
get it.
bottle of champagne.
I've one last question, and I would like to structure it. And it is, in a sense, it's a very honest and a very sincere question. Vera Maxwell is the first person from the industry that I've come to know on a personal level through the interviews and doing this project, having only been involved in the industry 3 years with FIT. Okay, I'm going to walk up.
No, I'm sorry. We have to have another session. I'm going to tape you. What have you been doing these 3 years? Okay. Go on. All right. Off we go.
I want to first ask, and it's unfair that one of you will have the privilege of listening to the other one, but by the same token, I want to ask the question. I think I'll ask it of Nancy first. Ms. White, I am a total stranger to the industry, and here is this person named Vera Maxwell. I would like to get from you, within a minute or two, a picture of Vera Maxwell. Who is this person called Vera Maxwell?
John, I hope this question comes after all that Sally has said and after what I've said on an earlier tape. We've just used the word, Sally used it so charmingly, a sparkly survivor. She's a dynamic person who has contributed extraordinarily to the industry with her enthusiasm and her curiosity and her ability to live with the downs as well as the ups, and she is 75, and as I believe we said with the film, celebrating her 50th year designing, her 30th year in business for herself, that to me speaks for itself. The fact that she is a marvelous looking lady who I'm sure doesn't do anything to her hair and is just pulls it back, Sally and I were talking about this. I mean, she's a sort of Renaissance lady, and Sally said within her own epoch. She does everything. I mean, she is not just a designer. She's a very big, interesting, fascinating person. And every aspect of her being, her intelligence, her reading, her dealing with people, I think is fascinating. I think she's really, I hope Sally will agree with me, I can't think of anyone right now in the fashion business that is Vera's, with Vera's caliber as far as living in a world that has changed tremendously. And at her age of 75, being so much a part of everything that happens today. Very windy. Sally, you do better.
Well, now I should have taken notes because, first of all, you forgot to mention what a great dancer she was. And I think
Okay,
that's
she
got
is.
to...
Particularly the Bernice Waltz.
But I think it's important because Vera... all right, now let's connect this with the other thing. Vera just pulls her hair back, that's true. And Nancy makes that act like she could just leave anywhere. Actually, what Vera does that I absolutely am so... Nancy spends more time with the hairdresser than I do because I have my hair straight, just have it cut. But let me tell you what I envy Vera for, is that she sits down in front of her mirror and she puts on K-O-H-L, Kohl, you know, whatever,
Right.
which incidentally, her best comes from some mysterious trip
Middle
up
Eastern.
right up in the Casbah or something. But anyway, and which incidentally Princess Caroline stole half of and sent her back some from Max Factor, and it made her quite cross. But anyway, she can make herself up in 2 minutes, and she is fascinating looking. And this lady she's a beauty. Now, I hope if you have any pictures I hope that when you run the pictures, there's one that I love, which is a Vera looking like Lana Turner. There is a absolute picture of her. Now, what she's got now is so funny. I mean, it amuses my husband because it's not Lana Turner, but it's also beautiful and it's a delicate beauty. And boy, is that, whether the hair's pulled back or not, are those eyes great? And is that now? I think winding up on this sort of frivolous note about how I don't like the way I make up and everything is wrong. So now I will have to excise part of this and get back to what you really wanted to know, which is what?
Vera is the person.
Aha.
Well, that's what I said I thought we'd said. And Sally, I think, has said far better than have I.
Well,
So
maybe
the summary shot, Sally, just
I think actually Vera as a person is an upward person, so I get sore as hell at her at times. I mean, she's got a temper and she's volatile, and therefore she's very interesting. I mean, to lots of people, and she's Viennese and so on. But I think I lost the track there somewhere, and I'm sorry for wasting your tape. Maybe I should read my speech I came in with. I have been a Vera Maxwell fan and friend for 45 over 50 years in business. I enjoyed selling her clothes in Lord and Taylor's college shop in the 1930s, photographing and writing about them in Vogue and Life and newspapers in the following decades. But most of all, I've enjoyed wearing them from my going away suit in 1938. No, I don't know whether this is. You've done that.
Yeah. I think
I didn't. Well, I don't know. I think. Well, I
Let me
think
give
Nancy. Well, you let me off the hook. I think she's a sparkly survivor. Oh, how about that?
Sally, let me challenge you for a moment.
You challenge me all you like.
You're an
Yeah.
incredibly bright person, which I could not admire more, and I'm
You're very
thrilled.
sweet to say so, but I don't really think I am.
Well,
Particularly
that's
with
part of it.
all this, machinery around.
That the feeling that you don't think you are is part of it, as a matter of fact. Here is Vera Maxwell at the age of 75,
Yeah.
still fighting to be recognized in her, to feel the feeling of recognition in her own mind.
Yeah.
She has fought the industry for 50 years. She has been a good designer. She has been a consistent designer. She has longevity.
Now, so we go right back to your early. She has fought the industry. What do you mean?
Well, by that meaning, she entered it as a woman in the 40s against
all right.
probably everyone else's
Yeah.
good wishes. And then just take it from there. But let's not dwell on that. Let's just dwell on the fact that here is a woman at the age of 75
Yeah.
wishing desperately to be remembered and to be thought of.
Is that on?
It sure is. To be thought of with a high level of respect. There's something about the character that needs that moment of recognition.
Golly, I really. I think if you really want an honest answer from me, I think that it's true of the whole of America. 1970, if you're 75, for God's sake, let a few of the young ones come along. Is that what you said? I mean, you're both. No. I think Vera has gotten a great deal of recognition in her life, and I think if she feels deprived of it now, that she's not perfect. She's my friend, and I told you she's volatile, and I'm not completely on her team. But I think, my gosh, a guy gets out of some design school and works for somebody for 3 years, gets fired, and goes someplace else, gets fired, and starts his own business, and he gets some publicity, and why not, And I do feel, possibly, and I do not, this is where we sign our paper, I do not wish this to go, I've told her in my own way sometimes, but I do not think that for 75 years you necessarily are front page news each and every day.
Miss Kirkland and Miss White, thank you for.
Are we wrapping?
We're wrapping, as
Yeah.
they say.
But listen, I'd like to say right over again, and I don't have a lawyer, and I don't need one, I know, with you, but I do have a friend in Vera, that these last few things that I'm saying, and I know why you're asking, but I don't see why we can't turn them around into something good rather than, like the last hurrah kind of thing. I think that somehow or other, if you can splice it, and I'm sure you can. You look very efficient about that to me. I wouldn't know how. But anyway, I just know that if you can put all the, not bad survivor, but the sturdy forward survivor, and she's still here. She's still making these clothes, and we're still loving to wear them. And it goes from me, and as I told you, I'm creeping up on her. I'll be 67 the 1st of July. Nancy's a teenager. Caroline is, Princess Caroline is, I don't know, 21 or whatever. All wearing her clothes and liking them and so on. That's, and you say you did do Tankos, who I love, and
No, we have not done Kathy Tankos,
No.
but
Oh,
we just
a
you
did-
other-
quote from Kathy that I gave to you.
Right.
I think to wrap, listen, let's think of, I don't know, Sally, when you get to be 75, whether I'm going to cope with the museum doing a party for you, but to pack that museum of the city of New York.
Can
on
I decline at this
miserable-
precise moment?
Well, I'm
I've
saying,
also told you, you cannot
I
come
know.
to my funeral.
I know,
You
I
know
can't come to your
that.
funeral. I know.
She goes to everybody's funerals.
I-
Everybody. Is that thing still
I
on?
don't.
She goes to all these funerals, and I say, Nancy, you cannot come to my funeral, and furthermore, tell all your friends not to.
What I'm saying, Sally, is that if I decide to give a party for you at 75 at some museum, I won't be able to pack it as well as that museum of the city of New York was packed on that miserably hot night when you nearly got
this
killed.
is good. That's right. Yeah, and it was
So-
a miserably hot night. You're right, and everybody, all those OK types, were supposed to be in Southampton or whatever, and they were jammed
in
in
New
there. It was really marvelous. It was a
Well,
lovely.
what else can you say? Now, if you give a party for me when I'm 75, I wanted it.
But I'm not going to give a party for you when you're 75.
not?
No, because I will be underground by the time you're 75, because you're the teenager, and
I wasn't thinking of it that way. You were a survivor too. You're a passionate historian, and I was thinking of Madison Square Garden and counting on you.
aha,
Philip.
very good. Well, now maybe
No,
by that
let
time.
us both say that. Listen, at 75, we'd love to.
Well, listen,
Be
at
as lively.
75, but I think that's pretentious of me because I'm almost 75.
That's
But,
No, that's- 8 years, Sally. And really, if we're telling the truth, it's 10.
wow,
He
no,
won't, I
no, no, wait,
Wait,
now I have to, listen, I really did type this thing. I
know,
said
you
something
read it.
here. Did I read it
Classic.
exactly? Oh dear, imagine doing all this typing.
And it's very good.
Did I do the part about social history?
No.
Aha! A lot of us feel that Vera is much a part of America's social history as that of its fashion.
I didn't hear that. I've been a little in and out.
Aha! Aha! Long before I hope these ahas will get exercised. Long before World War II, when most other designers were forced to depend on their own resources without the elegant help of Paris. Now you did hear that in another way. Vera had sensed that American lives were changing and that most of the French couture clothes were too formal and exact copy too difficult to wear and maintain. Now, this I think I did do. That is native sportswear. This feeling of good sturdy fabrics, ease of fit and cut, which gave us the option of dressing up or down, depending on the accessories, were right for city country living, for servantless, or almost, households, when those maids never did come back from the war plants, and for the post-war urge to travel everywhere by plane with baggage limitations, no time to get that dress pressed for the dinner with the London friends and so forth. Now, I'm sorry, I'm eliminating age and income difference. That, incidentally, I think, has anyone covered that because of Vera 75? Well, we sort of did. Vera 75
Go
and
ahead.
Caroline. I didn't really finish this. I was just typing away this morning and eliminating the age and income difference. You see, that's another thing we've covered, but the fact that Vera's clothes, they're not cheap, but they're not wild.
Out
I
of
mean,
sight.
you know, exactly. The very fact that my daughter, or your daughter, and you and I, and Caroline, and Princess, whatever. And then I said one has only to look at Vera herself and then dot, 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 dot. Because I was about to say the kind of things that she looks so elegant and like that way she goes out in the evening with that, you know, it's a black,
Shift.
absolutely, no tiny little fingers, no little eyes going blind and putting tiny little buttonholes up the back. You put it on, and then she puts her jewelry her way. And by the way, speaking of snob and reverse snob, she does indeed adore the 450 shoes from,
Expensive
but
shoes.
she also has a $120 little Cinderella, the princess come and put it on her foot with the buckle. Now let's see if I said anything else interesting. I was really working this morning.
If you work hard, and John appreciates.
No. I just want to see. I just wondered, did I get that classic
Friend of mine.
point across? Because I really, I
I think you started out with a classic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hit that very well.
I'll give it to you, and you can see. You can absolutely imitate my voice, so you can tell me it's wrong or whatever. You know.
Are you suggesting that my voice is high?
Au contraire, I suggested in the very first tape that my
I know,
voice is lower
that's
than
when I
yours.
was
You're being
very
very funny.
on.
You're being very funny. Okay, got it.
I would just like to say that I'm going to encourage both of you, and I'll say it right on the tape. I'm going to encourage both of you that when you get the transcripts of this tape, that
Not to be too tough.
that you tell us exactly what parts
Yeah.
to be restricted, meaning that for X number of years those parts will not be available, but that at some point in history, at your suggestion and at your design, that this entire tape be made available.
Well, you mean like John, the son, at the
Well,
That's the only thing I can think of
Well,
that I
25
said.
years from now
Read
or
the whole
whatever.
thing. I mean,
Absolutely.
25 after I've not been to her funeral, and she's given me the party at Madison
Is
Square
the tape
Garden.
still on? I want this whole funeral. Or
she wants to make
I
sure that this
will pay heavily for this tape.
She doesn't.
Nancy, exactly. Oh, really? I don't want Nancy orating or whatever at my funeral. And if you want me orating at yours, you have to put it another way.
No way.
Yeah, right.
No way. I've written off. Turn it off.
Okay. Thank you both very much.
Written a whole set of